Began his career in public service actually in the Peace Corps in the 1960s in Ethiopia, where he served for a couple of years before college, and then after law school he went back into the Peace Corps and served in the West Indies. And he began his political career in 1969 as a city councilor for Lowell, Massachusetts. A decade later, he was elected to the United States Senate, where he served on the Senate's Foreign Relations Committee, the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, the Small Business Committee. When time came for re-election in 1984, Senator Tsongas declined to run for office. The reason was that he had cancer. Senator Tsongas bravely fought the disease and did much more than survive. He joined the distinguished Boston law firm of Foley, Hogan Elliott, and in 1989 he was appointed the chairman of the Massachusetts Board of Regents of Higher Education. Although no longer in Washington, the former senator was deeply troubled by the failure of Congress and Presidents Reagan and Bush to keep the federal budget in control. Seeing a total lack of courage among political leaders who would not address the severity of our country's fiscal difficulties, in March 1991, Senator Tsongas wrote A Call to Economic Arms, a detailed plan to rebuild America's economy. He also announced his intention to challenge the then very popular George Bush for presidency of the United States. Although he did not win his party's nomination for the presidency, Senator Tsongas was the most influential man in setting the tone of debate in the 1992 presidential race. For the first time in years, thanks to Senator Tsongas, the important issues of the economy and the deficit took precedence over the petty personal attacks that characterized earlier races. Senator Tsongas continues to raise awareness throughout the country today about these issues through the Concord Coalition, a group he co-founded with former Senator Warren Redmond to help ensure that America retains its historically vibrant economy and world prominence. Senator Tsongas is going to speak briefly for about 15 to 20 minutes and then take questions from the audience. So please feel free to step up to the microphones on either side of the forum when he finishes his remarks. And please help me welcome the Honorable Paul Tsongas.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a couple of questions before I begin. One, I want to know who you are and why you're here. How many of you came because the room is air-conditioned? You're lying. You came, and this is the hottest summer we've had in Boston in a long time. But we're glad that you came and spent your money here, and we welcome you. Now, where are you from? Texas? Mexico? Korea? Where? Tenastiling. Indemanale. Kayet Meta. Cabosa? Oh, from Boston. Where in Ethiopia are you from? Wallo? Wallo province? Yetkatima? Desi? Waliso Taukale? Aren't you impressed? Yeah. You heard about every word I still remember after all these years. Well, let me welcome you, and particularly those of you who are from foreign countries like Texas. We've actually spent a lot of time in Texas lately on healthcare issues and the economy. What I would like to do is to, can you see the blackboard from where you are? We're going to talk about the federal budget deficit, but I want this to be a discussion about foreign policy and politics and whatever. But we have copies. Bill Crowley, who's over here, who's a Harvard graduate. That's all right. That's acceptable. Who has copies of, this is the plan of the Concord Coalition to balance the federal budget, to eliminate the deficit. And we can get into that. But what I'd like to do is suggest the philosophy, the political philosophy behind what I tried to do in 1991, 1992. Now, you have a problem, right? And that is that if I go there, the mic doesn't work, right? Here you have the allegedly leading university in the world that has no capability of a speaker to walk 3 feet away from the... Traditionally, in the United States and in other countries as well, the discussion generally is the political spectrum. And you have the liberals, or the socialists, or whatever, the Democrats, on the left, and you have the Republicans on the right. And basically, the fight is for those people in the middle. What I tried to suggest was that the country was ready for a different strategy. And the strategy basically was that the philosophy would be very liberal on social issues. And that would involve the, can you hear me all right? Okay. So here you would be talking about issues, for example, of race, in sharp contrast to, for example, the Willie Horton ad that George Bush, to his everlasting discredit, allowed to be used in 1988. And a lot of what has to happen in this country is we have to talk in terms of inclusion, that we are a multicultural society and we have to get to the point where everybody's part of it instinctively. I'm very impressed. The lesson here is if you complain publicly, you get a hell of a lot done. And, secondly would be on the issue of women's rights, and specifically a woman's right to choose on the issue of abortion. And issues like gay rights. I was the author of the original gay rights bill in the Senate back about almost 15 years ago. But so a very inclusive social philosophy. So, and this is very traditional liberal Democrat, even left of. Because although, for example, women's right to choose is now mainstream, the fact is that there are many liberal Democrats who still have trouble with gay rights. But to include that with a more centrist, almost Republican economic philosophy, which would be pro-growth, pro-economic growth, pro-business, and it would be fiscally responsible. So that would be a balanced budget. So the policies in here would be, for example, a zero capital gains tax for securities, et cetera, and balancing the budget, balanced budget amendment. So rather than be a Democrat who is liberal socially, but also believes in big spending and is anti-business, you would retain the social side of the Democratic agenda and wed that to a more traditional Republican view of the economy. And the fact is that I think this is where America is. That the average American is not a racist, is not sexist, is learning not to be a homophobe, and wants to be inclusive, but the average American also believes in fiscal responsibility. And so the campaign was an attempt to live in two worlds. And I think this is where the country is, and the strongest candidates running, I mean, in Massachusetts, Governor Weld fits this category. So that's why it's so hard for the Democrats to try to defeat. So anyway, that's the philosophy. Maybe I should talk about people. Let me see. Well, obviously, Weld would fit this category. I think also somebody like Colin Powell. It would be Bob Kerrey, senator from Nebraska. Clinton, to some extent, although I'm not always sure. And over here, you would have people like Graham of Texas, Dan Quayle. Who else is running for? Bob Dole would be maybe over here a bit. Jack Kemp would be here. Who am I missing? Alexander, I don't know where he's. My guess is Alexander would be here. But anyway, these are some of the people who want to be the Republican nominees in 1996. And part of what the Concord Coalition is going to do is to be very active in Iowa, the state of Iowa, and the state of New Hampshire, because they are the first two states in the presidential campaign. And so we will have people there who, when the candidates come through, will ask them how they would balance the federal budget. And so that's how we intend to be very active in forcing candidates to either adopt our plan or do their own, but to make it impossible for the first time in American politics to run for president without a plan to balance the budget. And that's basically what our group is all about. Anyway, I know that Eli wanted this to be a Q&A. I told him that I could speak for an hour, and he fainted. But let me stop, and I'd rather have this to be a discussion than a speech, so we have 2 microphones, and why don't we hear what you have to say.
Hi. I'm an economist, and I found my passport today so I can prove that I'm not an international terrorist. But just a joke. But one of the frustrating things about talks like this is that there's not very much detail on I mean, of course, balancing the budget is a popular thing to say, but do you think candidates should be defined more by their specific choices regarding the budget, and do you think the actual items, the actual line items on the budget should be more of a political issue?
Every oh, okay. I once gave a speech, and someone got up and asked me the question there, and I turned around, and then the person walked to his seat. I didn't know where the person was, and I spent the whole time answering the question this way, when the person was over there, and the audience thought I was crazy. So I learned my lesson. Every candidate will be in favor of a balanced budget amendment. Now, what we did, by the year 2000, the federal budget was supposed to be $200 billion in deficit. So our strategy was to say, how can you reduce the deficit to 0? And the reason we picked these numbers was we were dealing with Congress, and we figured they could understand 20000, that it was not very complicated. And so the 3 areas that you use, one is to raise taxes, and we do that on cigarettes, alcohol, and gasoline. And there are specific numbers. Here it's 50 cents increase in the gasoline tax over a period of time. We eliminate programs, and what we have in the book is a specific list of programs, and we also have alternatives. So if you don't like the ones that we've chosen, you can substitute. And so, for example, if you're from Texas, we eliminate the space station and the super collider. So if you disagreed, you could put those back in and do something else. But the major part of the program was to eliminate entitlements. Entitlements are Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare rather, farm subsidies, pensions, etc. And what we do is what we call means testing. Entitlements. So if you're wealthy, we don't give you as much money through these social programs. And the other thing we do is we limit in the United States, if you have a house and you pay your mortgage, you can, on your taxes, deduct interest and taxes on your house. And we would allow you to do that up to $20,000. But, so this means you could buy a house for $300,000 and deduct everything. But if you buy a house for $1 million, we're not going to allow you to deduct all that money. But if you do all this, you balance the budget. In fact, we also, by the way, add money for certain investments. So we eliminate more than 251, but we added another 10 or 15 for certain programs. But this is very doable. And so what we would want candidates to do is either adopt our strategy, or if you don't like how we would do it, how would you do it? And it's very specific in there.
It's interesting, I'm a baby boomer and beginning to think about Medicare. And I'm wondering, because there are so many baby boomers, any kind of means testing, I'd imagine, would be bureaucratically expensive. What do you have budgeted for bureaucracy in terms of means testing?
Yeah, actually, means testing is not very complicated now that you're in the computer age. And what we do is my using the blackboard helpful or confusing or irrelevant? Yeah. Somebody said both. If you okay, you are retired and your retirement income is $40,000. Okay. And 60% of the American retirees, I think that's the number, fit into that category. They're not touched. After 40, you lose a percentage of your check from Uncle Sam. So, from 40 to 50, you lose 10% of your entitlement checks above 40. Let me give you the for instance. Let's say you have $50,000 in retirement income. 40 is private pension and other investments, and 10 comes from Uncle Sam. We would take 10% of the 10, which is $1,000, away from you. So your retirement income is 49. So all you have to do is to have somebody's tax returns, and you can compute this very easily. This is actually bureaucratically quite simple. Something which is very complicated would be like a value-added tax, which is a nightmare to try to implement. But in terms of implementation, this is actually not very difficult in the computer age.
Referring to the political spectrum that you had on the board earlier, and also in light of the 92 Republican convention, what do you think the strategy of the Republicans will be in the 96 presidential election? What impact or role the religious right will still have, and do you think it will be abandoned, still play a role, or will they totally appeal to the center?
Well, I am a great admirer of the Republican strategy for 1996. And I speak that way because I'm a Democrat. And I think they're going to kill themselves. The Republican Party is moving right. When any party moves to the end of the spectrum, what they want to be is pure. And that's better than winning. We did it on the left. they will do it on the right. They believe that they can put anybody up and beat Bill Clinton. I disagree. So let's talk about the issues. One, here are the issues. The American people, most Americans are, as I said, inclusive, and the Republicans are going to give up all these groups. But if you're an African American, you're not going to be comfortable with, for example, a Bob Graham. If you're a woman, you will not like the anti-choice position. If you're gay, it's not even an open question, okay? So they will give up this to appeal to the religious right. Now, on economic issues, they have a problem because there isn't one Republican candidate for president who can balance the budget. And the reason is they have come out against taxes and against doing something with entitlements. So that means no person running so far, running for president on the Republican side can do a balanced budget. So in the business community, part of my job and the Concord Coalition's job is to make that known. So on economic policy, since Reagan and Bush were so terrible on the deficit, that whatever you may say about Bill Clinton, he's done a much better job bringing the deficit down. So that leaves foreign policy. Now, I don't know what's going to happen in foreign policy, but if things remain, it's not a Clinton strength, obviously, but you cannot run for president and beat a Democrat and give up these issues and run on foreign policy. Whatever problems the Democrats have politically are generally solved by the candidates the Republicans put up. So, the religious right, the religious right has a certain power because most people in this country, and I include myself, are very concerned about the disintegration of the family. No society has ever survived that was unable to have a cultural base and a base of values. Dan Quayle was right, by the way. And the fact is, Democrats are very reluctant to talk about family. Democrats do not talk about spirituality. And so most Americans who are now worried about the disintegration of the family and the social structure look to the Republicans, and we as Democrats should have something to say to those people. So we'll see what happens. And
how good a job has President Clinton been doing so far in balancing the budget? Is he on track? And if he's not on track, what should he be doing to get on track?
If he were a student here, we would give him A- in the first term and F in the second term. Year one, he did a very good job with the budget. And the Concord Coalition supported him. And actually, we did a scorecard on members of Congress voting. And those who voted for the Clinton economic budget package got double counting. But the attitude of the administration now is we've done it. And they have no plans to go any further. And what we're saying to them, the only budget deficit which is generationally moral is zero. And they have lost the will to balance the budget, have no plans to do it. And so we give them a very mixed report card at this point. Should I spend a minute and tell you what the numbers are on the deficit? Would that be helpful? The budget deficit George Washington to Jimmy Carter. Long time, right? The total debt after all those presidents, including World War I, World War II, and the Depression, not even to mention what happened in the centuries before, was $1 trillion, just a bit less. Ronald Reagan and George Bush, conservative Republicans, by themselves added $3 trillion. Outrageous. And the Clintons, let's say, will add 600. So the federal budget deficit, federal debt, which was $1 trillion in 1980, is now $4.6 trillion. Now, which means that today we spend approximately $212 billion each year interest on this debt. The federal budget is 50% entitlements, 18% interest on the debt, 17% defense, and 15% everything else. So the debt, which has been accumulated over the last 14 years, now means the interest we pay is the second largest item in the budget. Now, what does this mean to you? The comment about baby boomers and Medicare. What it means very simply is this, that if you are, somebody was from Missouri here. Who was that? Okay. Let me, how old are you? 20. Okay. If you went out today in the workforce, you would pay 7.5% of your salary for Social Security and Medicare. As the years go on, this number will go up to 8 to 10 and probably to 12. So your employer is going to have to match that, which means fewer of you are going to get employed because employers can't afford it, and a greater percentage of your income is going to go to pay for these two categories. That is going to happen at the same time when the 1970, for every person receiving an entitlement, if I remember these numbers correctly, there was something like 9 workers. And today, it's about 4 to 1. So that means in 1970, 9 people worked to support 1 person receiving entitlement. Now it's 4 people working for 1 person receiving entitlement, and by the year 2010, it'll be like 2.5 to 1. The only way that happens is if you raise the taxes on these people. And eventually the taxes on your generation become so horrific that you will revolt. And the other statistic I would throw at you, becomes a very messy board here. Listen to this carefully. It's somewhat complicated. The average person, the average American who retired in 1980 has gotten back every penny ever paid in Social Security, plus Medicare, plus interest. Okay. Plus every penny ever paid in federal taxes, plus interest. Okay. Imagine 10 years from now, 5 years from now, your generation is going to be asked to pay a higher Social Security tax to keep in retirement my generation, which gave you massive debt, and so much of what you pay in taxes goes to pay the interest on that debt, which you had no value from. While most of us have already gotten back everything we ever paid a long time ago. And what will happen is that you will say no. Because you will be paying much higher taxes than I ever paid. And at a time when you have concerns about mortgages and tuitions and all those kinds of things. So what is going to happen in the United States by the end of this decade is generational war. And that will be the dominant political divide in this country as the years go on. Because if you're young, you will not be able to explain to yourself why you are comfortable paying very high taxes to keep in retirement a generation which basically consumed. And in America, every generation in this country worked hard and left a better country behind. My generation is the first to consume and leave a lesser country behind in terms of the deficit. You will not respect that. So when the time comes to raise your taxes, you will not find that something that you can support, and you will look for candidates who will appeal to your resentment. And properly so.
Hi. Just to clarify your deficit debt numbers, maybe you could explain it to me a little bit better. Although Ronald Reagan and George Bush both proposed budgets during those years, isn't it true that Congress has the power of the purse and that those budgets were changed significantly, and that to say that the responsibility is on the backs of them is a little far-reaching, maybe?
Well, it's true, and your point is well taken, that Democrats voted for those budgets, but actually the budget submitted by Reagan and Bush, if passed as proposed, would have meant a higher deficit. Not by much, but, and what you had was a, if you will, a collaboration where Reagan wanted more defense spending, Democrats wanted more domestic spending, and Reagan wanted a cut in taxes, and everybody went along. But the fact is, the reason you run for president is to be in control. And the fact is Reagan was very popular, very, very powerful, and Democrats voted for his programs because they were afraid of him. I was there. I was one of the few people who voted against it. And I was one of something like 10 people who voted against his programs, because you cannot cut taxes and raise spending and balance the budget at the same time. But if I thought Democrats were any better, I would not have run for president. But I think history is going to be very unkind to Ronald Reagan on economic. He was a very nice, very compelling, very decent human being. But as time passes, it's interesting. Think of this. 1980, public support, Reagan, Carter. Where are they now? Carter has lived the perfect life post-president. And as most people would see it, and Reagan, I don't know what he's done, but his economic numbers, as the deficit begins to be understood, that legacy is diminished.
Yes. Well, the strategy you have described here, it doesn't tell us too much about foreign policy or where such a candidate, it leaves a lot of leeway. So I'll ask a question about foreign policy. And since we have people from many countries here, I'd like to ask about immigration. And I've been reading this book by John Kennedy, A Nation of Immigrants. And he recommended a generous attitude towards immigrants, also especially political refugees. And many of the reforms that he recommended have not been instituted yet. Matter of fact, we may be going in a backwards direction. So I'd just like to ask, what would you consider an enlightened policy for immigration? Or if you want to answer something specific, what do you think about the Haitian policy, or interdicting Haitians, returning people who are seeking political asylum?
Well, let me deal with foreign policy generically and try to fit your question in. I am an internationalist. I don't think the United States can be isolationist, and I don't think it's possible for the United States not to lead. The Europeans do not want to lead. When Mrs. Thatcher left and John Major took over, there was nobody left in Europe that I see as a true leader in a very confident manner. And the fact is that if the United States withdraws from its international responsibility, it will face crises anyway, and they will be worse. So what that means, let me go through some of the steps. What it means, for example, in Bosnia, that I think that the United States and the European allies neglected its moral responsibility and strategic responsibility and allowed a kind of genocide to exist and watched it from a distance. And if I were president of the United States, I would have demanded of the Europeans an interventionist policy that would have included not ground troops, but rather military strikes by aircraft in Serbia, things like utility lines, infrastructure, bridges, those kinds of things, and the arming of the Muslims, the Bosnians, so they could fight for their country. And you did not have Mrs. Thatcher there to make George Bush do this, the way she was very successful in the Persian Gulf example. And so nobody was ready to lead And I think what has happened in Bosnia is a travesty, that history will be very condemning of our emotional distance. In the case of Haiti, I would favor the idea that some have proposed of doing a kind of, if you will, to use the worst possible terminology, a kind of latter-day Bay of Pigs, in which I would train and arm Haitians who were prepared to go back to their country and to topple the regime. The fact is that Aristide has a certain amount of emotional support, but love facing bullets is an unequal equation. And so I think the suggestion of openly training Haitians to go reclaim their country is something I would have been very active in supporting. I think the sanctions are appropriate, but it hurts the wrong people. And I'm very troubled about mixed signals of giving people every incentive to get on boats and risk their lives and then changing your mind much later. I think eventually you have to have a military solution in Haiti, and I think there are a lot of Haitians who are quite able and capable and willing to perform that task within a larger Latin American or Caribbean with U.S. involvement. But I think that's far preferable to having the United States unilaterally go in and invade. In the case of North Korea, I think that there is no choice but to make sure that North Korea does not have nuclear capability. And if you ever get to the point where North Korea is able and willing to sell nuclear weapons to any state in the world, we will have entered into an era of catastrophe. And if you get into an era of nuclear terrorism, it's not going to be a very pretty world. And I think of all the crises that we have faced, that North Korea is by far the most serious. And Japan and China, at some point, have to begin to recognize their responsibilities. Japan and Germany in particular have been isolationist by constitutional decree and by history, but that era is over. And it's important for Japan to assert itself in the Pacific, and it's time for Germany to assert itself in the European Middle Eastern theater. But there is no way for the United States to withdraw into its own borders. Witness the World Trade Center. If you think of the World Trade Center explosions with nuclear weapons, it's a different country. It's a very different America, and one that all of us would be very uncomfortable being part of.
Switching gears back to domestic politics, do you think we can have universal health care and a balanced budget?
Yes. Would you groan if I went back to the board? Okay. In the interest of full disclosure, I will tell you that one of the clients of my firm is involved with healthcare that I do some work for, and what I do is I travel the country giving speeches on healthcare, and I argue for the position I took during the campaign. And so just so you understand that. Okay, same spectrum, left, right. The healthcare plan that I introduced, left would be Canadians style single pair. The far right would be it's just happened to work out this way. You're on your own approach. Okay. I wish I had thought of that a year ago before I could give you my speeches. Anyway, the healthcare program that I introduced in the presidential campaign had and this is what I would argue for today. One, portability. So you can take your health care from job to job. These are the insurance reforms. Secondly would be no pre-existing conditions. So like myself, if you've had cancer, you could still have access to health care. And three, insurance companies could not cherry pick. They could not choose their customers from just the young and healthy. It's what's called community rating. Four, malpractice reform. Get the lawyers out of medicine. You're not going to law school, I can tell. Five would be you pay for it with a cigarette tax and what they call limiting the deductibility of premiums. For example, if I'm a company and I have a healthcare plan and I give a better plan to my chief executive, that difference is not deductible as an expense. There's a lot of money in there. 6, cooperatives to purchase health care. So rather than individuals negotiating for health care, you put self-employed, unemployed, part-time workers in one huge pool, give them a card, and then the pool negotiates with the providers for health care. Now, what happened was and by the way, so this was my position and was also Bill Clinton's position 3 months later in 1992. What happened was the president's task force changed it. And what they did was they kept, these are the same. This is weaker. This is the same. This was eliminated. This became mandatory alliances. So, for example, today, a company providing health care would be left alone this way. This way, they would be forced into an alliance. For what reason? Because we're Democrats. We do those kinds of things. In addition, they added 3 new entitlements. 55-year-olds who retire early will be covered. So if you work for General Motors and you retire at 55, the government would cover you. So the government has taken over the responsibility of General Motors. Long-term care and drugs for the elderly. These are both very good, but they're very expensive. And the other thing they did was add new regulations like price controls. There are others. But what happened was you took this, which is what we campaigned on and moved it left. So it became much more a government program, became much more expensive, and much more regulatory. And what happened was, in September, when the president gave his speech, it was something like 72% support. And what's happened since then is the support has gone down as people have looked at the program. So what I'm saying, and these are the speeches that I give, is drop this, drop this, drop this, go back to this, and you can get support from both sides.
But does your plan pay for itself?
Yes. I didn't add here. It includes the, it's universal coverage, and it has the employer mandate. But the difference is that the package that we proposed is not as expansive as what they're talking about. Number one, does not include the new entitlements. Number two, and three, has as a second funding source. Okay. Now this balances. You take out the funding source, add the new entitlements, and have a bigger package, you blow the budget. So the problem is not universal coverage. The problem is what the package looks like, how you pay for it, and particularly how many of these new entitlements you want to add on. I would leave all of these out. So it's interesting. If you think about, remember NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement? When it was first introduced, it had no support. After all the discussion in the public, support went this way. Because the more people looked at it, the more they understood it, and the more they liked it. So you have a North American, South American, eventually common market. But on healthcare, the other thing happened. The more people looked at it in the details, the more concerned they got. And support has dropped, so now you don't know what's going to happen.
Can I take you back a little bit to the relationship between the deficit and the debt? As I understand it, the Concord group has proposed bringing the deficit down to zero in the year 2000, which is kind of akin to stopping the bleeding, so that we'll be spending, in effect, what we take in taxes. Yet we still are going to be spending 18% of our budget on interest, and I presume that we're not even touching the principal, which is over $4 trillion. Has your group proposed anything or have any ideas as to how we can start thinking about dealing with the principal and that long-term question?
Well, it's a very valid point. Even when you balance the budget, you still have the debt, which your generation will pay off, and we thank you very much. And the question is, do we have plans to go beyond zero, to have a surplus, and to pay off the deficit? The answer is that if you take our strategy, that the numbers come to zero and cross, so you'll end up in surplus. But if we balance the budget by the year 2000, Senator Rudman and I are going to retire, and somebody your age is going to have to take our place and fight the rest of it. But the fact is, you have to reduce the debt, and even if you reduce it even a small amount each year, the debt as a percentage of your gross domestic product goes down. So it becomes less of a problem, but you have to pay it off. You cannot leave this debt sitting out there. And today you have no fiscal policy, because if you're in a recession, you cannot, in a Keynesian sense, stimulate the economy because you already have too much debt. So not only is it good economic policy, but in terms of the generational responsibility that my generation has, we have to do that.
there's a lot of attention given to pork barrel politics in the media. How big a problem do you see that as far as contributing to the debt? And if you do think it's a problem, would that lead you to reconsider your support for the National Park unit up at Lowell, Massachusetts?
It's an interesting question. First of all, the pork barrel projects are irritating, but they are de minimis. The entire discretionary income of the federal government, this is everything, is only 15%, and the pork barrel, let's say, is at most, I would guess, 1/10 of 1%. In terms of the second part of whether I would vote against things that affect, one of the most controversial votes I took when I was in the House was vote against the B-1 bomber, much of which was produced in my district. So I have been very careful to try to differentiate between things that I think have value and things which I don't, even if they're produced in my district. And by the way, Marty Meehan, who's now the congressman, has the same philosophy. And Joe Kennedy represents this district. On NAFTA, for example, showed equal courage in doing what he thought was economically appropriate. Yes?
I concur with you that there's strong interest in reducing the deficit, and I think most of America does until their oxes gored themselves. I work in state government, and I get a lot of pressure in the type of work that I do to reduce unless it hurts me. And a lot of what you put up there is going to hurt a lot of people, and the special interests are going to make it, I think, probably impossible to get accomplished.
One lesson in politics in the United States is true everywhere in a democracy. And that is, let's take the issue of gun control. If you do polling on gun control, 80% of the American people are for it. I'm not doing the undecided here just for the, make the numbers easier. 20% are for, 80% are for, 20% are against. Who wins? Always. So you say, well, when I went to civics class, it was 50% plus 1. So how does the 20% win over the 80%? Well, in democracies, it's your percentage times passion. The fact is, 80% who, this goes back 5 years before Brady and so forth, but the 80% who are for it were for it, and the 20% who are against it were against it. And if you're a member of Congress, you multiply 20% times an index of 10 on a passion level, and here would be 80% times 1.5 on a passion level. These people will vote against you if you're wrong. These people vote on other things. Now, the only way you change this on the deficit or on gun control is to do something about this. So when I give my speeches, and I've been in about 25 states this year so far, There are three groups. If I appeal to you on the basis of good economics, I have a very limited constituency. So there are two other groups. One, the young, that I can speak to a student and tell him he's being screwed. And if I give him the numbers, he will understand that and he will care. His passion is increased. And whenever I or Senator Rodman go to a college campus, we have filled audiences. And we do not use rhetoric, we just give them the numbers. And they're smart enough to figure out what has happened to them. In fact, I spoke to Boys Nation in Missouri last month, and high school seniors, and asked them to go back and ask their parents how they could have done this to them. And so I may never get invited back to Missouri. And the third group, the most powerful group, are parents and grandparents. If you believe, as I do, that the strongest bond which exists in human nature is between the parents and the child, and you can get grandparents and parents to think about the deficit not in economic sense, but in a generational sense. And most of the supporters that we have, if you ask them, why are you with the Concord Coalition, they will talk about their children and grandchildren. So what we have to do, the theory is the weather vane. Congress is the weather vane. If you want to change Congress, you change the wind direction. You change the wind direction, Congress changes. So our job is to go out in the grassroots and organize. So I, as a candidate running for office, I come to a college. And somebody gets up and says, this deficit that you're doing, I'm going to pay for. How would you balance the budget? Or people running for Congress, or people running for president when they go up into New Hampshire, now the same thing. It has to be grassroots. It has to be angry. And what we want are students who understand that their world is going to be very different. If you have a less prosperous America because of the deficit, your social problems get worse. If you think you have violence now and dysfunctional young people, imagine what happens when there's no opportunity out there. So our job is to get people angry, so the passion level rises, so the politicians calculate. And I will tell you that it's working, and it's not just because I give so many speeches, I have a sense of it, but the most important vote last year was the so-called Penny Kasich. The Penny was a Penny Kasich. Penny is a congressman from, he's a Democrat from Minnesota, and Kasich was a Republican from Ohio. They had an amendment to cut the budget by $90 billion. It was opposed by the White House and by the leaders of the Congress. And the vote was something like 219 to 213 against it. So despite being obscure with no power, they almost won. And the good news beyond that is that if you divide the Congress between people who were there 3 terms or less, they voted for it. And the people who have been there 4 terms or more voted against it. So what's happening is the newer members of Congress are far more responsible, and they reflect what's out there. Whereas older members have been there for so long, they've lost touch with what's happening. So let me tell you, if I did not think that we could do this, I could not get on these airplanes. I spent a good part of my life gaining frequent flyer miles, and I could not do that if I did not believe this works.
Senator, I had a question, and then maybe we'll make this the last, because I know a lot of people need to go. Both parties seem to be sort of avoiding the program that you're advocating today, in the sense that there really aren't too many deficit hawks in the Democratic Party, and the Republicans, like George Bush and Ronald Reagan, also even the conservative Republicans fail to really come forth on this issue. Do you think that a Ross Perot or someone else very similar to him could come forward and capture the election in '96, or come very close to it? Or alternatively, do you see the Concord Coalition program sort of sparking a new party, a third party that as you say, is in tune with what the majority of Americans want?
Number one, Ross Perot should have won. The reason Ross Perot lost was because people, the more they knew about him, and so on the issue of the deficit and economics, he had the American people. Ross Perot never campaigned for president. The way he did it was he went on Larry King, which is a television talk show, said he might want to run for president, and before he ever campaigned was the leading candidate ahead of Bush and Clinton. It only happens when there's a vacuum, as you described. The Democrats were spending too much. Republicans were wrong on the social issues, wrong on the deficit. People said, they're both wrong, give us something else. Ross Perot comes along and Hosanna. What happened was that, and we are very complimentary of Perot, but Ross Perot began to say things. Remember the Black Panthers climbing over the fence at his daughter's wedding? And the story about blowing up the reef in Bermuda? And enough of those things begin to happen, and you begin to say, this person's going to have his finger on the nuclear button. This person's going to be head of the FBI and the CIA. No thanks. If Ross Perot had given people assurance on his temperament and had a reasonably articulate vice presidential candidate, he would be president of the United States today. No doubt in my mind. And so the lesson is to understand that Perot lost because of his personality, troubled people. But his message was very powerful. And if I were a Republican running for president, I would do is put a balance. You have all these other people running who cannot balance the budget. I would get up and say this or whatever. I'm the only Republican who can balance the budget, and I respect inclusion. And so I would say, Bob Dole, I'm going to balance the budget. You can't. Very powerful. If it doesn't happen, you will have a third party in the United States. A third party which will have this characteristic. I think that's a mistake, because I think a two-party system is stronger than a multi-party system. And my job is to move the Democrats this way, and Rudman's job is to move the Republicans this way, and we'll see what happens. But we are not a third party. We will not be a third party. But if neither party responds, it's going to happen anyway. And if you have a third-party candidate who's, think of Perot, who's maybe 6 inches taller, smaller ears, calm, collected, and responsible with the same kind of Perot's patriotism, which I find very appealing, and his willingness to tell the truth. That person could win. And I would hope that that person would be the Democrat. Revin hopes that person would be the Republican. So I want Clinton to do the following: support a balanced budget amendment, be more aggressive on gays than he's been. He's only gone halfway. And be more internationalist in foreign policy. I think he could win. On the Republican side, I think you're going to see somebody new. Weld, Dick Lugar. Anybody from Indiana here? Dick Lugar, who's a senator from Indiana, maybe a Lamar Alexander. I don't see the old guard surviving. As far as the religious right is concerned, that's going to be a problem for any rational Republican. And I think there are a couple that I've actually met along the way. So anyway, thank you very much. If you would like a copy of this, they're over there on the table. Sure.